Mark woke up to the gentle glow of the morning sun filtering through his bedroom curtains. It was one of those quiet, serene mornings he loved, where the air felt crisp and the birds sang their cheerful melodies outside his window. After a quick stretch, he shuffled to the kitchen to make his usual cup of coffee. As the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, Mark took his mug and stepped outside to his backyard, ready to enjoy the peaceful start to his day. But as soon as he opened the sliding glass door, his heart stopped. There, standing tall and imposing in the middle of his yard, was a brand new wooden fence. It stretched from one side of his backyard to the other, cutting across his well-manicured lawn as if someone had taken a ruler and drawn a line through his space. It wasn't just an eyesore. It was a territorial statement, loud and unapologetic. Mark stood there, frozen in disbelief, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He rubbed his eyes, hoping it was some kind of hallucination brought on by not being fully awake yet. But no, the fence was still there, its clean, polished wood gleaming mockingly in the morning sunlight. His backyard, the space he had carefully cultivated over the years with flower beds, a small vegetable garden, and a neatly trimmed lawn, now looked divided and invaded. "What the hell?" Mark muttered under his breath, stepping off his patio and onto the grass for a closer look. The fence wasn't just sitting on his property, it was slicing through it. His vegetable garden, the small corner he had spent countless weekends tending to, was now split in half, with several of his tomato plants sitting on the wrong side of the fence. Mark's disbelief quickly turned to anger. Who had the audacity to do this without even consulting him, and why? He crouched down near one of the fence posts, inspecting it. The wood was freshly installed, the posts firmly set into the ground with concrete. Whoever had built this had clearly intended it to stay for a long time. As he stood up, he noticed something even more infuriating. His yard hadn't been cleaned up after the construction. There were scraps of wood, stray nails, and bits of concrete scattered around. The pristine lawn he had spent years perfecting now looked like a construction site. Whoever had done this clearly didn't care about the mess they had left behind. Mark stormed back inside, slamming the sliding door shut behind him. He grabbed his phone and started scrolling through his contacts, trying to figure out who to call. Was this some kind of mistake? A prank? Or was someone in the neighborhood behind this? His first thought was the homeowner association, his neighborhood's homeowners association. The homeowner association had a reputation for being overly strict, enforcing rules about everything from mailbox colors to the height of hedges. Mark had had a few run-ins with them over minor issues, like the time he'd left his trash cans out a day too long, but nothing serious. Could they have ordered this fence to be built? He decided to start with his closest neighbor, Carl. Carl lived directly to the right of Mark's property, and while they weren't exactly friends, they had exchanged the occasional nod or wave over the years. Carl was also a member of the homeowner association board, which meant he might have some answers, or at least know who was responsible for this mess. Mark grabbed a jacket, slipped on his shoes, and walked briskly to Carl's house. His frustration grew with every step, the sight of the fence still looming in his peripheral vision. When he reached Carl's front door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking, trying to keep his anger in check. He didn't want to start off confrontational, but the sight of his divided yard was fresh in his mind, and it was hard to stay calm. Carl opened the door after a few moments, wearing a smug smile that made Mark's blood boil. He was dressed casually in a polo shirt and slacks, looking as though he didn't have a care in the world. "Mark," Carl said with a tone that was far too cheerful. "Good morning. What brings you by?" Mark took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Morning, Carl. I was wondering if you knew anything about the fence that just went up in my backyard." Carl's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider. "Oh, that, yes, I'm glad you noticed. It's part of a new project the homeowner association approved last week. We've been wanting to establish clearer property boundaries in the neighborhood, and your yard happened to be one of the first ones we tackled." Mark stared at him, incredulous. "Property boundaries? "Carl, that fence cuts through my yard. It's not on the boundary, it's on my property." Carl shrugged nonchalantly. "Well, the homeowner association's records show that the boundary is actually a few feet closer to your house than you might think. We consulted our maps and made sure everything was done according to the guidelines." Mark felt his temper rising. "Your maps? Carl, I have the deed to my property and I know where my boundary lines are. That fence is not in the right place." Carl held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, Mark, I understand you're upset, but this was all done for the benefit of the neighborhood. It's important to have clear boundaries, and this fence is part of that initiative. If you have any concerns, you're welcome to bring them up at the next homeowner association meeting." Mark clenched his fists, trying to suppress the urge to yell. "This isn't just a concern, Carl. This is a violation of my property rights. You can't just build something on my land without my permission." Carl's smile finally faltered, replaced by a patronizing tone. "Mark, I'm sure you'll come around once you see how this benefits everyone. The fence adds value to the neighborhood, and it's not like it's hurting anything." Mark didn't trust himself to respond without losing his temper, so he simply turned and walked away. His mind was racing as he returned to his house, thinking about the next steps. He needed proof. Something concrete that showed the fence was on his property and not where Carl claimed it should be. And he needed to act fast, before the homeowner association tried to pull something up. As he walked back into his yard, the sight of the fence only fueled his determination. This wasn't just about a line in the grass. This was about standing up for his rights and not letting someone like Carl push him around. Mark knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over. Mark didn't sleep much that night. The image of the fence slicing through his backyard kept flashing in his mind every time he closed his eyes. He replayed his conversation with Carl over and over again, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief at how dismissive Carl had been. How could someone be so arrogant and self-righteous? Carl's smug expression haunted him, and Mark knew he couldn't let this go without a fight. By the time the sun rose, Mark had already made up his mind. If Carl and the homeowner association wanted to challenge him on property boundaries, he was going to fight back with facts. He started by digging through his filing cabinet, where he kept all the paperwork related to his house. It took him about an hour to find what he was looking for, the property deed and survey report from when he bought the house. Both documents clearly outlined the boundaries of his property, and they didn't align with the placement of the new fence. In fact, the survey showed that the fence was encroaching a full 5 feet into his yard. Armed with this information, Mark decided to take the next step, hiring a professional surveyor to confirm the boundaries. He knew that having up-to-date, irrefutable evidence would be critical if this turned into a legal battle. After making a few calls, he found a reputable surveyor named Virginia, who promised to come by that afternoon. The hours dragged as Mark waited for Virginia to arrive. He kept glancing out the window at the fence, feeling his anger bubble up every time he saw it. The audacity of someone building on his property without permission was bad enough, but the fact that it was someone on the homeowner association board made it even worse. It wasn't just an invasion of his space. It was a blatant abuse of power. When Virginia finally pulled up in her truck, Mark felt a wave of relief. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with a clipboard in one hand and a measuring wheel in the other. After exchanging pleasantries, Mark led her to the backyard and explained the situation. Virginia listened carefully, nodding as he spoke. "You did the right thing calling me," she said. "This kind of dispute happens more often than you'd think, especially in neighborhoods with active homeowner associations. Let's take a look at your documents and compare them to what's on the ground." Mark handed her the deed and survey report, and she spent a few minutes reviewing them before starting her work. She measured and marked the boundaries, cross-referencing them with the documents. Mark watched her work, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He wanted to be proven right, but he also knew that if the fence turned out to be within the proper boundaries, he'd have to back down. After about an hour, Virginia finished her measurements and walked over to Mark, clipboard in hand. "Well, it's exactly as you suspected," she said. "The fence is definitely on your property by about 5 feet. Whoever installed it either didn't bother to check the boundaries or ignored them entirely." Mark felt a surge of vindication. "Thank you, Virginia," he said. "This is exactly what I needed to know. Can you provide a formal report that I can use as evidence?" "Of course," she replied. "I'll have the report ready by tomorrow. In the meantime, I'd suggest documenting everything. Take photos, record the exact measurements, and keep track of any communications with your homeowner association or your neighbor. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case will be." Mark spent the rest of the day following Virginia's advice. He took dozens of photos from every angle, showing how the fence encroached on his property. He even recorded a video walking along the fence line, narrating the measurements and pointing out how it cut through his yard. By the time he was done, he had a small mountain of evidence to support his claim. That evening, Mark sat down at his computer and drafted an email to the homeowner association. He laid out the situation in clear, professional language, attaching copies of his deed, the original survey report, and photos of the fence. He explained that the fence was a clear violation of his property rights and demanded its immediate removal. He also requested that the issue be added to the agenda for the next homeowner association meeting. After hitting send, Mark leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a lingering unease. He knew that dealing with the homeowner association wouldn't be easy, especially with Carl involved. Still, he was determined to stand his ground. The next morning, Mark received Virginia's formal report, which he quickly forwarded to the homeowner association. He also printed out copies to bring to the upcoming meeting. He was ready to make his case, no matter how much resistance he faced. As the day of the homeowner association meeting approached, Mark noticed that Carl had been avoiding him. Usually Carl could be found outside in the evenings, chatting with other neighbors or working in his yard. But now his driveway was conspicuously empty, and his blinds were always drawn. It was as if he knew he was in the wrong and was trying to avoid conflict. The night before the meeting, Mark went over his presentation one last time. He had organized his evidence into a neat folder, complete with tabs for each section: property deed, survey reports, photos, and correspondence. He even rehearsed what he was going to say, determined to stay calm and professional despite his frustration. On the day of the meeting, Mark arrived early and took a seat near the front of the room. The homeowner association board members, including Carl, sat at a long table at the front. Carl avoided making eye contact with Mark, his expression unreadable. As the meeting began and the usual agenda items were discussed, Mark waited patiently for his turn to speak. When the time finally came, Mark stood up and addressed the room. He explained the situation in detail, presenting his evidence step by step. He showed the photos, pointed to the survey reports, and read excerpts from his correspondence with Carl. The other homeowners listened intently, some of them nodding in agreement as Mark spoke. When he finished, there was a brief silence before one of the board members spoke up. "This seems like a serious issue," she said. "Carl, do you have any response to this?" Carl cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Well, as I've said before, the fence was installed based on the homeowner association's maps and guidelines. If there's a discrepancy, we can look into it, but I don't see why it's such a big deal. The fence benefits everyone in the neighborhood." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. "It's a big deal because it's my property," he said, his voice firm. "You can't just build something on someone else's land and call it a benefit. That's not how property rights work." The tension in the room was palpable as the other homeowners began murmuring among themselves. It was clear that many of them were on Mark's side, and Carl was quickly losing support. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed to review the evidence and revisit the issue at the next meeting. While it wasn't the resolution Mark had hoped for, he knew he had made significant progress. Fight wasn't over, but he was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The day after the homeowner association meeting, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. While he hadn't achieved an immediate resolution, he had planted the seeds of doubt in the minds of his neighbors and the homeowner association board. Carl's defensive and dismissive demeanor had been noted by everyone in attendance, and Mark could tell that people were beginning to question the integrity of the fence project, and Carl himself. But Mark wasn't naive. He knew Carl wouldn't go down without a fight, especially given his position on the homeowner association board. If anything, Carl's bruised ego would make him even more combative. Mark decided to double down on his preparations, ensuring that he was ready for whatever Carl or the homeowner association threw his way. That morning, Mark started by reviewing the homeowner association's bylaws. It wasn't exactly thrilling reading material, but he knew that understanding the rules inside and out would give him an edge. As he pored over the dense legal language, he came across several clauses that caught his attention. One in particular stood out. Any modifications to private property required the written consent of the... There was no ambiguity in the wording. Carl's fence clearly violated this rule, which gave Mark even more confidence in his case. Feeling bolstered by this discovery, Mark decided to take his evidence to the next level. He contacted a real estate attorney, a sharp and experienced professional named Stacy, who specialized in property disputes. During their initial consultation, Mark laid out the situation, showing her the survey reports, photos, and the homeowner association bylaws. Stacy nodded as she reviewed the materials. "You've got a strong case here," she said. "The survey report and the bylaws alone are enough to demonstrate that the fence is an overreach. But I'll warn you, cases like this can get messy. If the homeowner association or Carl decides to dig their heels in, it could escalate into a legal battle. Are you prepared for that?" Mark hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I don't want it to come to that, but I'm not backing down. This isn't just about a fence. It's about standing up for my rights." "Good," Stacy said with a determined smile. "I'll draft a formal letter to the homeowner association, outlining the legal violations and demanding the removal of the fence. Sometimes a strongly worded letter from an attorney is enough to make people rethink their actions." The letter was sent later that day, and Mark felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the matter was now in professional hands. But he also knew that Carl wouldn't take kindly to being challenged. His suspicion was confirmed when 2 days later he found a notice taped to his front door. It was from the homeowner association, and it accused Mark of disruptive behavior and creating unnecessary conflict within the community. But the meeting had taken place already that day. Robert had made a note of the conflict within the community. The notice went on to state that the fence was a valuable addition to the neighborhood and that any attempts to remove it would be met with legal action. Mark couldn't believe the audacity of the letter. It was clearly written by Carl, full of the same condescending tone he had used during their earlier conversations. But instead of discouraging Mark, it only fueled his resolve. He scanned the letter and forwarded it to Stacy, who quickly responded with reassurances. "This letter is nothing more than a scare tactic," Stacy wrote. "It holds no legal weight. In fact, it only strengthens our case as it demonstrates their unwillingness to address the actual issue. Don't let it intimidate you." Mark took Stacy's advice to heart and continued building his case. He reached out to other neighbors, particularly those who had attended the homeowner association meeting, to gauge their opinions on the matter. To his surprise, many of them were sympathetic. A few even admitted that they had their own grievances with Carl and the homeowner association's heavy-handed tactics. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Susan, shared her story of how Carl had fined her for having unauthorized decorations on her porch during the holidays. Another neighbor, a young couple named Jake and Emily, revealed that they had been pressured into repainting their house after Carl claimed the color was out of harmony with the neighborhood. These stories painted a clear picture. Carl was a bully who used his position on the homeowner association board to enforce his personal preferences. Mark began to see an opportunity to turn the tide against Carl. He decided to organize an informal meeting with his neighbors, inviting them to his house to discuss their shared concerns. The response was overwhelming. Nearly a dozen people showed up, eager to voice their frustrations and support Mark's efforts to challenge Carl's overreach. During the meeting, Mark laid out his case against the fence, showing the survey reports and explaining how it violated homeowner association bylaws. He also encouraged his neighbors to share their own experiences, which further galvanized the group. By the end of the evening, they had all agreed to attend the next homeowner association meeting together and demand accountability from Carl and the rest of the board. As the day of the meeting approached, Mark noticed a shift in the neighborhood. Word of the fence dispute had spread, and more people were expressing their support for Mark. Even those who had previously remained neutral were starting to question Carl's leadership. It was clear that the momentum was shifting, and Mark felt a renewed sense of hope. When the meeting finally arrived, the room was packed. Mark and his group of supporters took up the front rows, their presence sending a clear message. They were united and ready to be heard. Carl looked visibly uncomfortable as the meeting began, his usual air of confidence replaced by a strained smile. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he stood up and addressed the room with calm determination. He presented his evidence once again, emphasizing the legal violations and the impact the fence had on his property. He also read aloud the homeowner association bylaw requiring homeowner consent for property modifications, driving home the point that Carl had acted outside his authority. The room was silent as Mark spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. When he finished, Susan stood up and shared her story, followed by Jake and Emily. One by one, the neighbors voiced their grievances, painting a damning picture of Carl's leadership. By the time they were done, it was clear that the tide had turned. The homeowner association board, sensing the growing discontent, called for a private discussion among themselves. When they returned, they announced that the fence would be removed and that an independent review of the homeowner association's practices would be conducted. Carl, looking defeated, avoided eye contact with anyone as the meeting adjourned. For Mark, it was a hard-earned victory. As he walked home that night, he felt a sense of pride not just for himself, but for the community he had helped to rally. The fence might have been the catalyst, but the real victory was in standing up to injustice and holding those in power accountable. And as he stepped into his backyard, the sight of the looming fence no longer filled him with anger. Instead, he saw it as a symbol of what could be accomplished when people refused to back down. The announcement at the homeowner association meeting that the fence would be removed was a monumental victory for Mark, but the fight was far from over. He knew that getting the board to agree was only the first step. The execution of that decision and the aftermath would be the true test of his resolve. Carl's scowl and hunched shoulders as he stormed out of the meeting told Mark everything he needed to know. Carl wasn't going to let this go quietly. The next morning, Mark woke up feeling both relieved and anxious. While he had technically won, he couldn't shake the feeling that Carl would try to retaliate in some way. Mark's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter as he brewed his morning coffee. It was a notification from the neighborhood group chat, a string of new messages about the homeowner association meeting. Mark did an amazing job calling out Carl, one message read. Finally, someone stood up to him, wrote another. But one message stood out, and it wasn't as congratulatory. Carl's already trying to rally support for a special board meeting to reverse the decision, it read. It was from Susan, the retired teacher, who had been fined for her porch decorations. Mark's jaw tightened as he read the message. He had expected Carl to push back, but he hadn't anticipated that it would be so soon. He thanked Susan for the heads-up and made a mental note to stay vigilant. As the day went on, Mark decided to take the initiative. He emailed the homeowner association board, requesting a timeline for the removal of the fence and a detailed explanation of how they planned to ensure compliance with the decision. He kept the tone professional, but he made it clear that he wasn't going to let this issue drag on indefinitely. To his surprise, he received a response later that afternoon. The email was from Diane, the homeowner association secretary, who had always seemed more reasonable than the rest of the board. Mark, the email began, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We are currently working with a contractor to arrange for the removal of the fence. You can expect updates within the week. It was a promising start, but Mark couldn't afford to relax just yet. He spent the next few days keeping a close eye on his property and documenting everything. He took daily photos of the fence, noting any changes or activity. He also made a point to talk to his neighbors, ensuring that they remained informed and supportive. Meanwhile, Carl was not taking his defeat lightly. Rumors began to circulate that he was pressuring other board members to reconsider the decision, claiming that the fence was a necessary improvement for the neighborhood. Mark heard from Jake and Emily that Carl had been going door to door, trying to sway residents to his side. "He came to our house yesterday," Jake told Mark. "He said you were being unreasonable, and that the fence was for the good of the community." Mark was furious, but not surprised. Carl's attempts to manipulate the situation only strengthened Mark's resolve. He decided it was time to take things a step further. With Stacy's help, he drafted a formal demand letter addressed to both the homeowner association and Carl personally. The letter outlined the legal violations, the financial impact on Mark, and the potential consequences of failing to comply with the board's decision. "This should get their attention," Stacy said as she reviewed the final draft. "If Carl continues to push back, we'll have a solid case for escalation." The letter was sent out the following day, and the effect was immediate. Within 24 hours, Mark received an email from Diane, who reassured him that the board was committed to following through on their decision. She also hinted that Carl's behavior was becoming a concern for the rest of the board. "We are addressing the matter internally," she wrote, though she didn't provide specifics. For the next few days, Mark waited anxiously for updates. Then, one morning, he woke up to the sound of heavy machinery in his backyard. He rushed outside to find a crew of workers dismantling the fence. The sight was both surreal and satisfying. The intrusive structure that had caused so much stress was finally coming down. Mark watched as the workers methodically removed the posts and hauled away the debris. He couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication as the fence disappeared piece by piece. By the end of the day, his backyard was restored to its original state, and the cleanup crew had even taken care of the mess left behind. But the victory was bittersweet. While the fence was gone, Carl's presence in the neighborhood remained a looming threat. Mark knew that as long as Carl was on the homeowner association board, there was always the potential for more conflicts. That evening, Mark decided to host another informal meeting with his neighbors. He wanted to thank them for their support and discuss the next steps for holding the homeowner association accountable. The turnout was even larger than the first meeting, with several new faces in the crowd. The sense of community was palpable, and Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. During the meeting, Susan brought up an idea that resonated with everyone. "We need to take back control of the homeowner association," she said. "If Carl and his cronies won't act in the best interests of the neighborhood, then we need to replace them." The group agreed, and they began planning a campaign to elect new board members. They discussed strategies for outreach, the importance of transparency, and the need for a fair and inclusive homeowner association. Mark, despite his initial reluctance to get involved in homeowner association politics, found himself stepping into a leadership role. His fight against the fence had earned him the respect and trust of his neighbors, and he was determined to use that momentum to create positive change. As the meeting wrapped up, Mark felt a sense of optimism he hadn't experienced in weeks. The fence might have been the catalyst for conflict, but it had also brought the neighborhood together in a way he hadn't thought possible. And as he looked out at the faces of his neighbors, people who had once been strangers but were now allies, he realized that the real victory was in the community they were building. The next morning, Mark received an unexpected email from Diane. "Mark," it began, "I wanted to personally thank you for your patience and persistence throughout this process. Your actions have inspired many of us to take a closer look at how we operate as a board. I believe this is the beginning of a new chapter for our neighborhood." Mark smiled as he read the email. For the first time in weeks, he felt a genuine sense of peace. The fence was gone, the neighborhood was united, and Carl's influence was finally waning. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a promising start to something better. And as he stepped outside to enjoy his now unobstructed backyard, Mark realized that sometimes the hardest fights are the ones most worth having. The removal of the fence felt like a significant triumph for Mark, but the victory was far from the final chapter of this ordeal. While the physical barrier in his backyard was gone, the lingering resentment and tension in the neighborhood were undeniable. Carl's stubbornness and refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing continued to cast a shadow over the community. Mark knew that if real change was to happen, the homeowner association itself needed to be reformed, and that meant addressing the root of the problem: Carl's unchecked power. In the weeks following the fence's removal, Mark focused on rallying his neighbors. The informal meetings he had started hosting grew in size, and the conversations became more pointed. People who had once been too afraid to speak out about the homeowner association's overreach were now finding their voices, sharing stories of fines, arbitrary decisions, and Carl's intimidation tactics. Mark realized that the fence had been a tipping point, a symbol of a broader issue that had affected the entire community. One evening, Susan, the retired teacher, approached Mark after a meeting with a suggestion that had been quietly circulating among the group. "Mark," she said, "you've done so much for this neighborhood already. Have you thought about running for the homeowner association board?" Mark blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The thought had crossed his mind, but he hadn't taken it seriously. He had never been one for politics, even at the neighborhood level. "I don't know, Susan," he said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." "Are you kidding?" Susan replied with a warm smile. "You've shown more leadership and integrity in the past few months than Carl has in years. People trust you, Mark. We need someone who actually cares about this community to step up." Her words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. As Mark sat in his backyard that night, gazing at the now open space where the fence had once stood, he thought about the responsibility that came with such a role. He had fought hard to protect his rights and had inadvertently become a voice for his neighbors in the process. If he could make a difference as a homeowner association board member, wasn't it worth considering? The next day, Mark made his decision. He announced at the next meeting that he would be running for a position on the homeowner association board. The room erupted in applause, with neighbors eagerly volunteering to help with his campaign. It wasn't just about removing Carl anymore. It was about building a better, fairer homeowner association that represented the interests of the entire community. Mark's campaign quickly gained momentum. He and his neighbors went door to door, talking to residents about their concerns and sharing their vision for a more transparent and inclusive homeowner association. Mark emphasized the importance of fairness, accountability, and community-driven decision-making. He promised to prioritize the needs of the residents over the personal agendas of board members, a message that resonated deeply with many. Carl, predictably, did not take this challenge lying down. He launched his own smear campaign, accusing Mark of being anti-homeowner association and claiming that his removal of the fence had been an act of vandalism. Mark knew that Carl's tactics were desperate attempts to cling to power, but they still stung. He responded by staying focused on his message, refusing to engage in personal attacks, and continuing to build trust with his neighbors. As election day approached, the neighborhood was abuzz with anticipation. Signs supporting Mark popped up on lawns, and his meetings grew increasingly packed. It was clear that the tide was turning, but Mark refused to let himself become overconfident. He knew that change was never guaranteed, and he was prepared for the possibility of a setback. On the evening of the election, the community gathered in the homeowner association's meeting hall to cast their votes. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, with neighbors exchanging encouraging words and casting knowing glances at Carl, who sat silently at the front of the room. When the votes were finally tallied, the announcement came. Mark had won by a landslide. The room erupted in cheers, and Mark felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. His neighbors' faith in him was humbling, and he knew that he couldn't let them down. As he stood to give his acceptance speech, he spoke from the heart. "This victory isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all of us coming together to create a community we can be proud of. The homeowner association is here to serve the residents, not the other way around. I promise to work tirelessly to make sure that every voice is heard and that we move forward with fairness and respect." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Mark worked closely with the other newly elected board members, many of whom had been part of his campaign, to overhaul the homeowner association's practices. They implemented new policies to ensure transparency, such as requiring open meetings and publishing detailed minutes. They also created a grievance committee, allowing residents to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. One of Mark's first actions as a board member was to review Carl's past decisions. What he found was a pattern of questionable behavior, from misappropriated funds to unauthorized fines. The board voted unanimously to remove Carl from his position, citing violations of homeowner association bylaws and abuse of power. Carl's departure marked a turning point for the neighborhood. Without his domineering presence, the community began to heal. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started reaching out to one another, fostering a sense of camaraderie that had been missing for years. The changes implemented by the new board brought a renewed sense of trust and optimism. One sunny afternoon, as Mark sat on his patio enjoying the peacefulness of his backyard, Susan stopped by with a plate of homemade cookies. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said. "You've done more for this neighborhood than anyone ever has. We're lucky to have you." Mark smiled, humbled by her words. "I couldn't have done it without everyone's support," he replied. "This is our neighborhood, and we all made this happen." As Susan left, Mark looked out at his yard, which was now completely his once again. The fence that had caused so much turmoil was gone, but in its place something even stronger had been built, a sense of community and a shared commitment to fairness and respect. For the first time in months, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had been hard fought, but it had been worth every moment. Not only had he reclaimed his property, but he had also helped create a better future for his neighborhood. And as he sipped his coffee, watching the sunlight dance across the grass, he knew that the fight had been about more than just a fence. It had been about standing up for what was right.